Welcome to the Centre for Legal Leadership and to Financial CrimeCast. I'm Sam Tate, Head of White Collar Crime and Compliance at the law firm RPC. And in this series, we will have the pleasure of speaking with leaders in the field of financial crime, compliance and ethics to discuss their experiences, what they've learned along the way, and what financial crime issues they see on the horizon. In this episode, we are joined by Lucille Dolor, a global leader in compliance and ethical approaches to doing business. Lucille has a real wealth and depth of experience across a range of industry and is often at the cutting edge of thought leadership. Lucille, I'm delighted that you could spare us some of your time today.
Sam, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of these series of discussions. Can I just say that I think the work that the Centre for Legal Leadership and RPC is doing is great by providing that resource for lawyers to help them develop their in-house careers. I particularly like the fact that the focus is on providing resource for everything other than the law. We know that most lawyers are adept at finding answers to legal questions, so this focus on creating more rounded business people is fantastic. So well done, and thank you for talking to me again.
Well, thank you. And I do think it's an important area and one that doesn't see a lot of light. So thank you for helping us explore some of those issues about how to be, a better, more attuned advisor. I think many people tuning in to listen to this webcast will be interested in your own journey in the field. And so I thought we might start there. And if you could just talk a little bit about your career in compliance and ethics and how you got into this field.
Thank you, Sam. So I qualified, I'm a dual qualified lawyer, and I qualified originally as a barrister and solicitor in Nigeria. And on return to the UK, I sat what used to be called the Qualified Lawyers Transfer Test, attended the College of Law whilst in a full-time company secretarial role. And I was very fortunate at that time to also be able to do my training contract, which was required at the time in-house. And it was a fabulous opportunity to do some really fantastic and quality legal work. Moving on from that, I then held a number of senior governance roles and was company secretary for a number of UK-listed companies. I came to ethics and compliance about 10 years ago. My career started about 10 years ago when I took a role in a UK-listed engineering industrial, and I had responsibilities there for heading the group secretarial team, as well as assuming responsibility for developing and leading the global ethics and compliance program for a business which had operations in multiple jurisdictions. So I'd say I've had about 10 years in my ethics and compliance role and thoroughly enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. And 10 years is a long time in this game. And I appreciate I probably shouldn't call it a game, but, it's a quickly developing area and, one in which there were so few practitioners 10 years ago. So, Lucille, could you now talk a little bit about your career changes? And here I'm thinking about your work as a company secretary and the leadership that you showed in that role and how you brought those skills across to ethics and compliance.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say, Sam, my last role was as I mentioned, I was, head of secretariat, so I was secretary to the board committees as well, leading the secretariat function and leading the compliance program. And my experience was having that broader governance and legal background held me in good stead for my compliance career, and in many ways made my compliance and ethics career easier. There is that ongoing discussion, like you will be well aware of, that chief ethics and compliance officers should have a seat at the table, should be in the C-suite, and should have a seat at the table for all the reasons that we know. The reality, however, is that we know that not every chief ethics and compliance officer will be a member of the top leadership team. And therefore, how do you have that visibility of the business, strategy, and operational challenges that your organization is facing? However, as the company secretary or the senior governance executive in your organization, you are in the boardroom and you are part of that broader business discussion. And it does give you the opportunity to ensure that compliance and ethics issues and challenges and even opportunities are discussed or raised as part of those discussions and not after the fact. I'll give an example of how that was a real advantage for me in my prior role. I was secretary to the remuneration committee, and as part of that was responsible for developing and reshaping the compensation strategy for the executive team, working with the chief executive and the remuneration committee. Alongside that, at the same time, I was very keen to see leadership accountability for ethics and compliance really being driven in the leadership team and ensuring that ethics and compliance outcomes were linked to rewards and incentives in the business. I was able to shape that discussion and drive that discussion wearing those two hats. So perhaps an easier sell for me to do, because on one hand, I was in the room with the board talking about the compensation strategy for the most senior people in the business, but as well being able to then convince them around what we needed to do in terms of linkage to ethics and compliance. The other thing I would say is, as a company secretary, you have had the opportunity to build credibility with your board and senior leadership team. And that certainly can be helpful then when you come to have some of those perhaps more difficult discussions you have to have as the chief ethics and compliance officer with the senior people in your business, because you have that credibility established.
Just thinking about what's happened in your career, what would you be telling your younger self? So, that person who got into the area 10 years ago, or what things would you share with that person now?
Well, there are a number of things, Sam, and I'm going to sort of talk about this not so much in the context of a legal or compliance career, but any career, anybody thinking about developing their career. I would be saying actively seek and get yourself a sponsor. That can't be overemphasized. I perhaps was not so intentional. I had many advocates in my career, but I wasn't intentional about seeking a sponsor. And I think it's important to have somebody with a seat at the table that will champion and advocate for one in the room. And we know that sponsor could be your boss, but may not be your boss, could be somebody else in the C-suite. And it should be a person who's vested in your career development and upward movement and willing to use their influence and networks to connect you to high profile and stretch assignments, connect you to people and promotions. The other thing I would say, again, it's never too early in your career to build your network and your brand. And one shouldn't be afraid to promote oneself inside and outside your organizations. And I think maybe looking back to that sort of 10, 20 years ago, lawyers have not always been very good at promoting themselves and taking the view that their good work will speak for itself. Maybe lawyers are getting better at it now, but I would certainly say, build that network, be intentional about it, but come at it from a good place, be altruistic. Don't think about your network and brand simply from the position of what can you get out of it, but also think about what you can give back as well. And I'd finally say, be your authentic self.
Well, I think that all resonates with me, particularly that point around working with your network and building it out and helping people. It sounds like we've had similar experiences there, but it's still quite a small community in compliance and ethics, and even in financial crime. And it does kind of lend itself to knowing people and building a network. and a series of people with kind of common interests. I mean, clearly you have a tremendous wealth of experience, and you've built that network. I dare say there's hardly anybody you don't know in the business. And thinking about that, I'm interested in what you think are the current trends in compliance and financial crime.
I think when we just think about the current pandemic, post-pandemic, we're probably still in the pandemic environment that we're in at the moment. I think fraud absolutely has to be up there, that we can expect to see an increase in fraud. We've seen and read the reports last week that HMRC estimate about 2 billion that was intended for furloughed workers have been claimed fraudulently, in some cases by organised criminals, in some cases by employers who have claimed for employees that have continued to work, or they've overinflated their claims. So that's an area where my view is that all businesses that have had to take support from the government during this period can expect scrutiny. I know there's a lot of dialogue, Sam. I'll be interested in knowing your view around, whether the HMRC and enforcement authorities have the resources to track down fraudulent claims. But I think businesses should be expecting some kind of scrutiny in the period to come, I would say. The other thing I would mention is, bribery and corruption risk. We can certainly expect an uptick there for several reasons, things like supply chain issues, poor due diligence, and so on. But one point I would particularly like to stress is the impact of the economic downturn and pressure to perform on the bottom line. And I would say that ethics and compliance officers, they have an imperative at this time to be guiding and challenging their leadership around things like financial goal setting and how business is run at the moment. I think there's been a lot of commentary that regulators and prosecutorial bodies will not accept corrupt behavior as a result of the pandemic. And finally, cybercrime. We are all in a working from home environment. Businesses are increasingly focused on driving digital strategies, and we can expect that there will be an increase in cybercrime.
Well, I mean, I certainly agree with all of those points. And you asked for a comment there in terms of the resources of prosecutors and investigators. Well, we know that the NCA asked for another £1 billion of funding not too long ago, in the last 2 years. So presumably they will need more funding if there's really more work in this area. And I think that there will be, for all the good reasons that you've given. The SFO quite recently said that it wasn't looking for more funding. And maybe that's because it's only dealing with the biggest cases. And we know it's dealt with a few big cases like Airbus, so maybe it has the bandwidth to take on some of those very big cases. And as for HMRC, we've seen an uptick on their work, and we will just have to see if their resources are enough. They sent out thousands of letters, so-called nudge letters. Presumably, they have the resources to deal with them when they come back. When they get their responses. Shall we move on to this next question then, of what you see the challenges, of what the challenges are for compliance officers in the next 12 months, particularly having regard to the current environment of the pandemic, something we've been touching on together.
We've talked about some of the trends that compliance officers will be facing, sort of the external, the macro factors in a macro environment. And maybe if we turn our minds to some of the internal challenges they will potentially face within their businesses as a result of the pandemic and the potentially Brexit-induced economic downturn. I think defending your budget and resourcing potentially will be a challenge for compliance and ethics officers. unless you are dealing with a regulatory or enforcement issue. I think most people will say they can expect a contraction in the investment in their compliance and ethics programs in the near to medium term. I think that as a result of that, there will be greater emphasis on demonstrating what the return on investment from ethics and compliance programs will be. And compliance officers will need to think about how they can achieve more for less, and potentially having to think about smart collaboration and smart working. How do you then draw on resource in the wider business to help you, not simply the resource within the compliance team? And how do you engage with your leadership team to drive ethics and compliance, deeper into the business? The other thing I think will be a challenge for compliance officers is how do you keep ethics and compliance and financial crime and all of those things front and center of the minds of the board and the leadership team, given all the commercial and other priorities that businesses are facing. And I would say that programs that have been successfully positioned and demonstrated as a source of competitive advantage will probably fare better. So thinking about it much more broadly than simply compliance and meeting regulatory requirements, but have you been successful at demonstrating to the business that if you get it right and you have the right sort of culture, it is a source of competitive advantage for your business. And Sam, one thing I do want to mention, we've been talking about, the pandemic, but I think the other seminal moment we've seen this year rather, is the Black Lives Matter protest and the subsequent call for change, for organizations to be more equal, diverse, and inclusive. And my view is that actually ethics and compliance officers have a role to play, particularly if your bailiwick extends to working with your leadership team to shape the culture of your organization. I would say that compliance officers then have a responsibility to make sure that frank conversation about race, systemic racism and discrimination is happening within their businesses. But on top of that, tangible and sustainable actions are taken within their businesses to drive for change. It's the right thing to do, but there's also a commercial imperative for it. And it was interesting to see that Legal & General recently have issued a warning to FTSE 100 companies that there will be voting and investment consequences for companies that fail to diversify their leadership teams by January 2022. So there may be the view by compliance and ethics officers that this falls within the bailiwick or the responsibility of their people and HR teams. But I would say as a senior leader within a business, there is a responsibility on ethics and compliance officers, particularly if culture is important within your business.
I think there are so many people who work in compliance and and regulatory teams that actually, they employ a lot of people, and they need to consider diversity and inclusion within their own kind of groups. But I share the concern that COVID-19 and other issues will essentially push asunder D&I projects and work that needs to be done. Whereas the real challenge is how do we change things on a number of fronts at the same time with all the pressures that come to businesses that perhaps aren't doing as well post the pandemic. And I would also agree that it is an issue that sits with ethics and compliance every part as much as it does within personnel teams. So it will be an important area for the next 12 months. I certainly can see that. Obviously, you've worked with many businesses. Are there any insights you can share if you were to go to a new business? What would be the first few things you might want to talk about with your new company?
I would say the first few things I'll want to do in a new organization is listen, Sam, and learn.
Well, I think that's an excellent answer, and I couldn't agree more with it. There's always this point where you enter into a new role or you're advising a new client, and the first thing you need to do is understand what's going on. In terms of kind of practically dealing with compliance, one of the things which you were stressing was the importance of being more effective and working more collaboratively with the business. And I'm sure that lots of people listening to this will have those kind of pressures where there'll be a cap on resources, or maybe they won't be able to hire. Is there anything you can share there? Practical ways of working with businesses for, virtual compliance teams, for instance, or local leaders, or ways of working effectively with tech and the business that you think might contribute to efficiently working with a lower budget than before?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good follow-up question, Sam. So there are a number of ways, Sam, in which compliance teams can and should collaborate with the business. It will depend on the maturity of your program and the size of your organization, but perhaps let me speak to two. First of all, develop your program so that your controls and processes are built into your organization's business workflows. There are a number of advantages to this sort of integration. But to answer your specific question about collaboration, it should mean that, for example, your finance colleagues can deal with transaction testing. HR is responsible for matters like new employee screening, monitoring conflict of interest matters, and developing compensation strategies that drive the right behaviors. Your supplier due diligence processes form part of the procurement workflows, and the relationship management of your sales channel partners sits within your sales function with some compliance team oversight. The second thing, Sam, and we've had conversations about this in the past, as you know, the way that I have strived to calibrate programs in the organizations that I've worked in is to argue quite strongly that driving and shaping the culture within a business and embedding ethics and compliance is not solely the responsibility of the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, but it is a wider leadership responsibility. Now, in the current environment, which is challenged, leadership is, of course, focused on a myriad of business priorities, and there is that added complexity of remote working. That said, if your leadership team recognizes that having an ethical culture is key to achieving the long-term sustainability of your business, then you are well positioned to leverage your leadership colleagues to drive your program. And here I'm not just talking about training delivery or driving your controls and processes or compliance with financial crime regulations. Really what I'm getting at is it's about developing your leadership team so that ethics and compliance considerations are taken into account during decision making as it relates to matters like strategy, the business model, objective setting. That around that table, management is asking questions such as, will our go-to-market model drive unethical behavior or expose us to financial crime risk? Even when the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer is absent from the room. And I believe that if you are successful in leveraging leadership in this way, not only can you achieve more with less resources within the compliance team, you protect the business and you will have a program that is a source of competitive advantage and a true business differentiator.
Thank you. Well, Lucille, thank you very much for your time today and speaking to the Centre for Legal Leadership and being so open about how you see the trends and your own career experiences. It's fantastic talking to you. I've really enjoyed it. I'm sure many people who have listened will have done too. So thank you very much from the Centre of Legal Leadership for joining this Financial Crime Cast.
Thank you very much, Sam. Good talking to you too. Thank you.